Before I begin, I want to make something completely clear. This is not a video arguing that Bakugo never changes. It's not a video denying his character development, claiming his apology means nothing, or arguing that he remains a terrible person for the entire series. Bakugo genuinely becomes a much better person. By the end of My Hero Academia, he becomes a great hero. He becomes more compassionate, more self-aware, and more willing to acknowledge the harm he caused. He becomes someone Midoriya can genuinely depend on. He becomes a real friend to him. I'm not going to refute that development because I don't disagree with it. My issue is much less about the person Bakugo becomes by the end of the story, and much more about the foundation of his relationship with Midoriya and how that relationship is treated throughout the series. Because even if their relationship eventually becomes healthier, that does not mean it began as a normal rivalry. It did not. It began as an extremely unhealthy attachment shaped by years of bullying, fear, admiration, insecurity, and emotional damage. And while the story acknowledges part of that, I do not think it ever gives the foundation of their relationship the profound exploration it deserves. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not arguing that Midoriya's response to Bakugo is unrealistic. Trauma isn't linear. People don't all respond to abuse, bullying, or emotional pain the same way. Some people become angry, some people withdraw, some people completely cut the other person out of their lives. Some people internalize what happened and begin blaming themselves. Some people continue to admire, love, or seek validation from the same person who has been hurting them. All of those responses can be real, so I'm not going to say Midoriya reacted incorrectly. His response is not any less valid or believable simply because another person might have responded differently. If Midoriya hated Bakugo, that could have been realistic. If he avoided him completely, that could have been realistic. If he continued admiring him despite being afraid of him, that could also be realistic. My criticism is not necessarily Midoriya's psychology. My criticism is how little the story profoundly explores that psychology and how the people around him react to it. Midoriya is not simply acknowledging that Bakugo is talented. He idolizes him, he studies him, he praises him. He sees Bakugo as this perfect image of victory, confidence, and greatness, even while Bakugo is actively treating him terribly. And that is where I think the relationship becomes deeply uncomfortable. Again, I can believe that Midoriya would feel that way. What I struggle with is how rarely the series stops to ask what that admiration actually means. Because there are a lot of people who summarize the beginning of their relationship by saying, Bakugo bullied Midoriya. That is true, but even the word bullying can sometimes make what happened sound less serious than it was. Bakugo did not just make fun of Midoriya occasionally. He repeatedly insulted him. He humiliated him. He socially degraded him. He physically intimidated and assaulted him. He used Midoriya's quirkiness and insecurities against him. He tried to reinforce the idea that Midoriya was worthless and should remain beneath him. And at the beginning of the series, he told Midoriya to kill himself. I do not know whether everyone watching has ever had someone tell them to kill themselves. I have, but that is an extremely serious thing to say to someone, especially someone who is already vulnerable. Midoriya grew up quirkless in a society that placed an enormous amount of value on quirks. He was repeatedly told that his dream of becoming a hero was impossible. He already struggled with feeling inadequate. Bakugo knew that. He knew how badly Midoriya wanted to become a hero. He knew Midoriya was already being made to feel lesser because he did not have a quirk, and he still told him to jump from the roof and hope for a quirk in another life. Imagine if Midoriya had actually tried to do it. Bakugo would not have been the only reason. Years of discrimination, social isolation, rejection, and hopelessness surrounding Midoriya's quirklessness would also have contributed, but Bakugo would have been part of it. And we know that the person Bakugo becomes later would have carried unimaginable guilt over that. The fact that Midoriya did not attempt suicide does not make the statement harmless. It only means the worst possible consequences did not happen. Now, going into my next point, the violence is softened by anime logic. Because this anime and Bakugo's quirk is used constantly, it becomes easy to stop thinking about what an explosion actually is. We see characters get blasted in walls, covered in soot, and standing back up moments later. The genre softens the actual physical implications. It's similar to something like Pokemon. Ash or Team Rocket can get hit by attacks that would knock out incredibly powerful Pokemon, and they're still mostly fine afterward. The amount of damage changes depending on what the scene needs. You can argue that Bakugo controlled the power of his explosions when he attacked Midoriya as a child. That is completely possible, but they were still explosions. He was using a destructive superpower against a quirkless child. Midoriya realistically could have gone home with burns, bruises, damaged clothing, or other injuries that the story simply does not linger on. The series practically opens up by showing Bakugo and a group of children surrounding Midoriya while Bakugo attacks him with his quirk. The scene is somewhat exaggerated because of the genre, but really think about what's happening. A child is using explosions to physically assault another child who cannot defend himself. It's played down because that's how anime violence frequently works, but when we actually examine what is happening, it is disturbing, and it deserves far more seriousness than the story often gives it. Now, to understand why Bakugo behaved this way, we have to examine his childhood. Bakugo was praised constantly. People saw his powerful quirk and immediately told him that he was talented, exceptional, and destined for greatness. When you spend your entire childhood being told that you are better than everyone else, you may eventually begin believing it. Sometimes people put so much stock into a child's talent that the child begins building their entire identity around that praise. Bakugo began believing he was superior. Strength became connected to his personal worth. Winning became proof that he deserved the praise he had received. Weakness became humiliating, and Midoriya threatened that worldview. Bakugo considered Midoriya weak. He considered him worthless because he was quirkless. But Midoriya continued following him. Midoriya continued trying to help people. Midoriya continued reaching out to Bakugo. And when Midoriya offered him help, Bakugo did not interpret it as compassion. He interpreted it as pity. If someone he considered beneath him believed he needed help, then maybe Bakugo was not as invulnerable or superior as everyone had taught him to believe. Midoriya's kindness exposed something in Bakugo that he did not understand. That is why Midoriya got under his skin so badly. That explains Bakugo's anger. It explains his inferiority complex. It explains why he reacted so strongly to Midoriya. But explanation is not the same as justification. Bakugo's pain does not make what he did right. His insecurity does not erase Midoriya's pain, and understanding why he acted that way does not mean the people around him should have been less firm about his actions. This brings me to another complicated aspect of this relationship. Bakugo is also treated as someone who needs to be saved, and before I explain why that sometimes bothers me, I want to be fair. Bakugo is still a child. Just like Midoriya, he's a teenager dealing with profound emotional problems that began in his childhood. He was constantly praised for his power. He was taught to associate weakness with failure. His superiority complex did not develop in a vacuum. The adults in society around him helped create it. That doesn't mean Bakugo is undeserving of empathy. He absolutely deserves empathy from his teachers, classmates, and the adults around him. He's still growing, he's still learning, and underneath his aggression was an insecure child who built his entire identity around being stronger than everyone else. Bakugo did need help. He needed to be saved from the beliefs he had developed about strength, weakness, and his own worth. That's actually one of the things I appreciate about My Hero Academia. The series understood that saving someone does not always mean rescuing them from a villain or pulling them out of a collapsed building. Sometimes people need to be saved from their own pain, resentment, fear, and destructive beliefs. Bakugo was one of those people. My issue is not that the story shows compassion toward him. My issue is that this compassion sometimes comes at the expense of fully acknowledging what his pain caused Midoriya. Because a lot of the conversation surrounding Bakugo is framed like this. Bakugo is hurting, Bakugo feels inferior, Bakugo cannot understand Midoriya, Bakugo has spent his life believing strength determines someone's value, therefore, the people around him need to help him understand his feelings and become better. And I agree with all of that, but the other half of the conversation should be, Bakugo is hurting, and because of that pain, he has been hurting Midoriya. We need to help Bakugo, but we also need to protect Midoriya and acknowledge what Bakugo has done to him. Those are two different approaches. One centers Bakugo's suffering, the other recognizes his suffering while still holding him responsible for how he responded to it. Sometimes it feels as though the story approaches the situation by saying, Bakugo is in pain, so we have to help Bakugo get out of that pain. Instead of saying, Bakugo is in pain, that pain is causing him to hurt Midoriya, and we need to address both. Bakugo needs empathy, but Midoriya also needs protection, validation, and emotional support. The two should not be mutually exclusive. And you have to remember that Midoriya was already struggling before Bakugo began bullying him. He grew up quirkless in a society that treated quirks as an incredibly important measure of a person's worth and potential. His dream was repeatedly dismissed. Even his mother, while loving him deeply, initially apologized to him rather than telling him that he could still accomplish his dream. Midoriya grew up believing there was something fundamentally missing from him. Bakugo knew Midoriya was struggling. He knew Midoriya desperately wanted to become a hero. He knew Midoriya had been made to feel lesser because he was quirkless, and he continued reinforcing those insecurities. Even as Bakugo grew old enough to recognize that his words and actions were hurting someone, he kept doing it. He insulted him, threatened him, used his quirk against him, tried to force him back into the position Bakugo believed he belonged in. And I know I'm repeating things here, but Bakugo's childhood explains how his superiority complex formed. And while it does do that, Midoriya was also carrying emotional damage from childhood, and Bakugo knowingly added to it. Both children needed help, but the story often treats Bakugo as the one who needs to be understood, while Midoriya is expected to already understand him. Midoriya is compassionate enough to recognize Bakugo's insecurity. He understands him almost instinctively, but who's taken the same amount of time to understand what Midoriya experienced? And this brings me to something that All Might says after Midoriya and Bakugo fight. He describes them as finally becoming proper rivals, and that line has always made me wonder, what were they before that? What did All Might think their relationship was before they became proper rivals? Because what existed between them was not merely an immature rivalry. A rivalry involves two people competing with each other. What Midoriya and Bakugo had was deeply unbalanced. Bakugo had power, he had confidence, he had social approval, he had years of praise reinforcing his belief that he was superior. Midoriya was quirkless, he was socially isolated, he was afraid of Bakugo, and he still desperately wanted Bakugo's acknowledgement. Bakugo repeatedly degraded him and tried to keep him beneath him. Midoriya, meanwhile, continued admiring him. That's not simply two competitive childhood friends who lost their way. That is a bond shaped by trauma, damaged self-worth, fear, and an intense emotional imbalance. I hesitate to use trauma bond as a clinical label because that term has a more specific meaning, but their attachment is unquestionably rooted in trauma. They have history. They have emotional attachment, but that attachment developed alongside years of abuse. And I don't think the story fully acknowledges the depth of that. The series recognizes that they have a strained relationship, don't get me wrong. Characters know they have problems with one another, but the foundation is often softened into the language of rivalry. And Aizawa does something similar to All Might when discussing Midoriya and Bakugo during the provisional licensing exam. He describes them as two students who do not get along well. Technically, that is true, but it is also such a massive oversimplification that it reflects my larger problem with how the people around them understand their relationship. They don't merely struggle to get along. They don't simply have clashing personalities. They are not two equally stubborn kids who need to learn how to communicate. One of them spent years bullying the other. Bakugo physically assaulted Midoriya. He repeatedly degraded him. He used Midoriya's quirklessness and insecurities against him. He conditioned Midoriya to fear him while Midoriya continued admiring him. He told him to kill himself. That is far more complicated than two students who do not get along. And I understand that Aizawa was briefly explaining the two students to another teacher and did not have time to explain their entire history. Of course he didn't. But the wording is still revealing. It reflects the kind of language the series frequently uses around them. They have a strained relationship, or they're childhood rivals, or they don't communicate properly, or they need to learn to work together. All of those statements contain pieces of the truth, but none of them fully acknowledge the power imbalance, trauma, or years of abuse that created the conflict in the first place. Calling it a rivalry makes it sound mutual. Calling it a disagreement makes it sound equal. Calling it poor communication suggests that both of them contributed to the relationship becoming unhealthy in comparable ways. They did not. Midoriya may have unintentionally challenged Bakugo's insecurities. He may have continued pursuing him when Bakugo wanted distance, but Midoriya was not abusing Bakugo. The relationship became toxic because Bakugo responded to his own insecurity by repeatedly harming him. That distinction matters. And this segues me into my next point. The story praises Bakugo before he earns that praise. During the provisional licensing exam, Aizawa talks about how Midoriya and Bakugo elevate the class. I think the clip played in the background a couple times already. He says that their presence raises the standard of everyone around them and that their passion spreads through the class. And I can understand part of what he means. Bakugo is incredibly competitive. He wants to win more than almost anyone else. He refuses to accept mediocrity from himself. That kind of passion can naturally affect the people around him. I've met people like that in real life. Playing football, you admire their confidence, you respect their passion, you appreciate how hard they push themselves. But sometimes they're also such overconfident jerks that their behavior nearly cancels out everything admirable about that person. About that passion, I mean. You can look at someone and think, I admire your confidence and competitiveness, but you are also being unbearable. At that point in the story, Bakugo is still an enormous jerk. He insults his classmates, he tells his own friends to shut up, he treats most people as if they are beneath him. He's still rude toward Midoriya, even though their relationship is slowly changing. He has not yet become the person he eventually becomes at the end of the series. So, when Aizawa places Bakugo in the same category as Midoriya and describes them both as figures who elevate the class, it feels strange. Midoriya inspires people through qualities we usually associate with heroism. He's hopeful, he's selfless, he constantly looks for ways to save people. He recognizes potential in people who do not recognize it in themselves. He pushes himself towards the top, but his ambition does not require him to degrade everyone beneath him. Bakugo inspires people through competitiveness and determination, and those traits can be valuable. But at this stage, those traits are still tangled together with arrogance, hostility, poor emotional control, and a tendency to mistreat people. There's a difference between saying Bakugo has qualities that could eventually make him inspiring and saying Bakugo is currently one of the two central figures elevating this entire class. The latter feels like the story praising him before he has earned that level of praise. And I think the central problem is that the adults around Bakugo frequently mistake his heroic potential for heroic character. Bakugo has the tools to become an extraordinary hero, or had since the series is over now. He's brave, he's intelligent, he's observant in battle, he is relentless, he's incredibly talented. He remains composed under certain kinds of pressure. He wants victory so intensely that he pushes himself beyond his limits. Those qualities are real. But being capable of becoming a great hero is not the same as already behaving like one. At this stage in the story, Bakugo's character has not caught up to his talent. The adults see his potential and begin praising him as though he has already completed the emotional growth necessary to fulfill it. And that is almost exactly what happened to him as a child. People saw his powerful quirk and immediately told him he was exceptional. They praised what he could do before examining who he was becoming. UA is obviously more responsible than his childhood school. Several teachers do challenge him, but sometimes they still repeat the same fundamental mistake. They look at his strength, ambition, and passion and conclude that he elevates everyone around him. Meanwhile, the emotional consequences of his behavior are treated as secondary. And to be fair, I'm not saying Aizawa is entirely wrong. Bakugo can and did inspire his classmates. His refusal to surrender pushes people to work harder. His talent gives them a standard to chase. His confidence can force others to stop underestimating themselves. People are complicated. Someone can positively influence a group while still behaving destructively in other ways. But that complexity should be acknowledged. Aizawa could praise Bakugo's ambition while recognizing that his aggression and treatment of others were serious problems. The story could praise the parts of Bakugo worth praising without romanticizing everything surrounding them. Bakugo's competitiveness is valuable. His abuse of Midoriya is not. His determination is inspiring. His refusal to respect people is not. His confidence can raise the standard of a room. His cruelty can also make that room unsafe. Those distinctions matter, especially in a story about learning what it means to become a hero. And this is why I also have complicated feelings about the practical exam where Midoriya and Bakugo are paired together against All Might. I understand the educational purpose behind it. The teachers recognize that the two of them struggle to cooperate. They want them to overcome their differences and work together. And for aspiring heroes, that is a reasonable skill to test. Heroes will not always like the people they need to work with. They have to put personal disagreements aside when lives are in danger. But Midoriya and Bakugo are not simply two co-workers with incompatible personalities. The school is placing a child on a team with the person who bullied and physically abused him for years. And the timeline makes that even more uncomfortable than it may initially seem, because My Hero Academia takes place over a relatively short amount of time. To the audience, Bakugo telling Midoriya to jump from the roof may feel distant because years passed while we watched the anime or read the manga. But within the story, it was recent. By the end of the main war, Midoriya and his classmates have not even completed their first year at UA. So when the teachers pair Midoriya and Bakugo against All Might, it has not been years since Bakugo told him to kill himself. It may only have been a matter of months. Think about that. An adult institution takes a child and pairs him with the person who recently told him to take his own life, attacked him with a dangerous superpower, and spent years convincing him that he was worthless. Then the adults effectively tell them, you need to work out your differences if you want to pass. That is not simply a teamwork exercise. That is asking Midoriya to temporarily set aside years of trauma under extreme pressure. It is asking both students to unpack a deeply unhealthy relationship while being attacked by the strongest hero in the world. Sorry, the cars outside are being very loud. That is an enormous emotional burden to place inside a training exercise. And to me, the correct response would have begun long before putting them on the same team. Aizawa or All Might should have spoken to them separately. Someone should have asked Midoriya directly about their history, not simply, why do you two fight, but are you afraid of him? How long has he treated you this way? Has he used his quirk against you before? Why do you continue admiring someone who hurts you? Do you actually want a relationship with him? Bakugo also needed to be confronted individually. He needed an adult to ask, why does Midoriya's presence make you this angry? Why do you see his kindness as an insult? Why do you respond to insecurity with violence? Do you understand what your behavior has done to him? Only after those individual conversations should they have been brought together. And even then, the immediate goal should not have been friendship or rivalry. The goal should have been safety, accountability, boundaries, and basic respect. Instead, the exam forces them into cooperation and treats their eventual success as evidence that they can overcome their problems. Midoriya returns to save Bakugo, they create a plan, they pass, and because Midoriya is heroic enough to come back for him, the situation ends on an uplifting note. But they do not actually unpack the relationship. They survive a test together. That is not the same thing as resolving years of emotional damage. Another thing that's always rubbed me wrong is that Midoriya is expected to be the bigger person a lot of the time. The resolution between them in that training exercise depends heavily on Midoriya being who he always is. He's compassionate enough to return for Bakugo. He refuses to abandon him. He places the mission and Bakugo's safety above his own feelings. That is heroic. But once again, Midoriya's kindness becomes the mechanism through which Bakugo is allowed to move forward. Midoriya is the one who understands. Midoriya is the one who reaches out. Midoriya is the one who overlooks the hostility. Midoriya is the one who comes back. Bakugo grows during the exercise, but Midoriya's emotional labor makes that growth possible. And because Midoriya is naturally selfless, the story rarely asks whether he should have to carry that burden. His kindness is admirable, but sometimes the narrative uses that kindness to avoid forcing other characters to confront what has been done to him. The provisional licensing exam makes this contradiction especially obvious because the same arc contains one of the clearest consequences for Bakugo's behavior. He fails. His inability to communicate appropriately with frightened civilians and provide reassurance prevents him from receiving his provisional license. That is a good consequence. It directly challenges the idea that strength and determination are enough to make someone a hero. And Bakugo may be talented, he may be intelligent, he may be one of the strongest students at UA, but if frightened civilians cannot trust him, his attitude is not merely a personality quirk, it becomes a professional failure. That is one of the few times the story seriously confronts his behavior, but the same arc still frequently frames his hostility as part of what makes him cool, passionate, and inspiring. Seiji, the Shiketsu student with the flesh manipulation quirk, criticizes Bakugo's behavior and says it is unbecoming of a student representing UA. And he's right. Seiji has his own issues, his methods are not exactly heroic either, but his criticism of Bakugo is still valid. Bakugo is representing one of the most prestigious hero schools in the country, yet he insults everyone around him. He calls other students extras. He refuses basic courtesy. He behaves as though acknowledging someone else's value would diminish his own. That is unbecoming of UA. It was unbecoming of an inspiring hero. But the scene mostly becomes an opportunity for Bakugo to reject the criticism with another aggressive declaration about not being there to make friends. The criticism becomes another Bakugo moment. Instead of seriously challenging his behavior, it reinforces the image of Bakugo as someone so focused on victory that he does not care what anyone thinks. And the audience is encouraged to admire that passion. But sometimes the person criticizing Bakugo is not misunderstanding him. Sometimes Bakugo is simply behaving badly. This happens repeatedly throughout the series. Someone criticizes Bakugo's behavior, Bakugo responds aggressively, the scene becomes comedic or cool, then everyone moves on. His hostility becomes entertainment. His refusal to show basic respect becomes evidence of his determination. His inability to communicate becomes part of his charm. Even valid criticism becomes another opportunity to celebrate him. And I think that is one reason his development is sometimes harder for me to embrace than otherwise would be. The story wants us to recognize that Bakugo is flawed, but it also loves those flaws. It wants his anger to be funny. It wants his aggression to be exciting. It wants his insults to be memorable. It wants his competitiveness to inspire the class. It wants his refusal to back down to make him look heroic. That creates a contradiction. The same qualities supposedly holding Bakugo back are constantly rewarded by the way the narrative presents them. He may face occasional consequences, but his behavior still earns him attention, admiration, victories, and some of his coolest moments. So when the story eventually asks me to celebrate how far he's come, part of me wonders whether it ever fully admitted how serious that starting point was. And honestly, if I were an instructor at a school for future heroes and discovered that an applicant had recently told another child to kill himself, that would drastically affect how I viewed his admission. I'm not saying Bakugo should have been permanently banned from becoming a hero. He was a teenager. Teenagers can say and do horrific things and still grow into better people. The purpose of education should include helping young people change, but that history would require immediate intervention. A child who wants legal authority to use a destructive superpower in public needs to demonstrate emotional control and respect for human life. Telling a vulnerable, quirkless classmate to jump from a roof is directly opposed to what a hero is supposed to represent. It should not have been treated as an unpleasant comment everyone could eventually forget. It should have raised serious questions about whether Bakugo was emotionally prepared for hero training, and if UA admitted him, the school should have created a clear plan for addressing his behavior. Counseling, anger management, supervision, clear consequences for threatening or attacking another student. Restorative conversations, but only if Midoriya willingly agreed to participate. Instead, UA largely relies on Bakugo growing through experience, and he does grow, beautifully so. But his eventual growth does not make the adult's lack of intervention responsible. Todoroki also makes Bakugo's behavior harder to excuse. To be clear, people do not respond to trauma identically. Todoroki and Bakugo are completely different people with completely different childhood experiences. Bakugo's childhood taught him that he was superior. Todoroki's childhood taught him that he was a tool. Their pain manifests in different ways, but Todoroki enters UA drowning in anger, resentment, and unresolved trauma. He hates his father. He rejects half of his own identity. He's emotionally distant and often cold, yet he does not spend years terrorizing a vulnerable classmate. He can be rude, he can be dismissive, his anger interferes with his judgment, but the story does not need to make him abusive toward innocent people to communicate that he's struggling. Again, Bakugo's response can still be realistic. Some people lash out. Some redirect their insecurity toward other people, but understanding why someone responds badly does not mean their cruelty should be treated as just another colorful expression of teenage pain. Bakugo still made choices. He repeatedly chose to direct his insecurity towards someone weaker than himself. That deserved more than comedy, admiration, and occasional consequences. And this brings me into one of my next points. There's a conversation between Bakugo and All Might that I want to revisit carefully before finalizing this video because I may not remember the exact wording. But from what I recall, when Bakugo reflects on how he treated Midoriya, All Might responds in a way that suggests Bakugo may be judging himself too harshly. And if I am remembering that correctly, I think it perfectly summarizes my issue. No, Bakugo should not destroy himself with guilt. He should not believe he is permanently evil. He should not believe he can never become better. He was a child dealing with insecurities that adults around him helped create. But recognizing those circumstances does not mean he's being too hard on himself for acknowledging the damage he caused. Sometimes guilt is appropriate, not endless self-destructive guilt, but enough guilt to force someone to confront their behavior honestly. All Might could have acknowledged both sides. He could have told Bakugo, yes, what you did in Midoriya was wrong. You contributed to how he sees himself, and you need to take responsibility for that. But understanding that does not mean you are beyond redemption. What matters now is what you choose to do with that knowledge. That would preserve empathy without minimizing accountability. Bakugo needed someone to help him understand that his mistakes did not have to define the rest of his life, but he also needed someone to tell him plainly that his pain did not justify what he did to Midoriya, especially All Might. All Might has the emotional intelligence to recognize what is happening. He can be goofy and socially awkward, but he understands people. He recognizes the underlying issue between Midoriya and Bakugo. He eventually recognizes Midoriya's lack of self-worth, so I think he should have been much firmer. He should not have shied away from telling Bakugo, yes, you did contribute to this, heavily. What makes this even more frustrating is that the story clearly understands Midoriya's lack of self-worth. All Might recognizes it, Bakugo recognizes it. They discuss Midoriya's habit of destroying himself to save other people. Bakugo eventually acknowledges that he contributed to Midoriya's inability to value himself. That is important. It demonstrates real self-awareness and growth. But I don't think the series spent enough time examining how profound his contribution was. Midoriya grew up constantly hearing that he could not achieve his dream. Then the most talented child around him repeatedly reinforced that message. Bakugo did not merely insult Midoriya, he helped shape the way Midoriya understood himself. When Midoriya receives One for All, he gains power. But receiving power does not instantly repair years of emotional conditioning. His willingness to destroy his body for other people is heroic, but it also reflects how little he values his own well-being. Bakugo is not the only cause of that, but he is undeniably part of the foundation. It is good that Bakugo eventually admits this, but acknowledging it is not the same as fully exploring the damage. And this is where I'm going to talk about Bakugo's apology. After rewatching it, I think I better understand why it never completely worked for me. It is an important scene. Bakugo finally admits he was wrong. He openly acknowledges that Midoriya's strength frightened him. He explains that Midoriya's willingness to help people exposed a weakness in Bakugo that he did not want to confront. He admits that he bullied Midoriya because he could not understand him and wanted to keep him beneath him. He even calls him Izuku. For Bakugo as a character, that is enormous. It demonstrates a level of humility that would have been unimaginable at the beginning of the series. I understand why so many viewers love the moment. But as an apology to Midoriya, I think it's incomplete. Most of the apology focuses on Bakugo. It focuses on what Bakugo believed, why Bakugo felt threatened, why Bakugo pushed Midoriya away, how Bakugo misunderstood him, how Bakugo eventually realized he was wrong. Those things are important to Bakugo's character development, but an apology should not only explain the person who caused the harm. It should also acknowledge the experience of the person who received it. Bakugo spends much less time discussing what he actually put Midoriya through. He does not fully say, "You did not deserve what I did to you. I knew you were already struggling and I made your pain worse. I helped you convince that your life and well-being mattered less than everyone else's, and I used your kindness and admiration against you. I treated you like you were worthless even though you repeatedly showed more courage and compassion than I did. You deserved a friend and I chose to become one of the people who hurt you instead." That is what feels like it's missing. And explaining yourself can sound like making excuses. This is something I've had to learn even in my own relationships. Sometimes when we apologize, we immediately start explaining why we acted the way we did. From our perspective, we may genuinely be trying to provide context. We may be saying, "I want you to understand what I was feeling." But to the person we hurt, it can sound like, "Here are the reasons you should not fully hold me responsible." Even if that is not our intention, explanations can begin sounding like excuses. That doesn't mean someone should never explain themselves. Understanding why something happened can be important, especially if two people are trying to rebuild a relationship, but timing and focus matter. When you first apologize, the priority should be acknowledging the other person's pain. The explanation should not overshadow the harm. And that is my issue with Bakugo's apology. We already understand much of what he explains. The series has shown us his insecurity. We know Midoriya's instinctive heroism challenged his beliefs about strength. We know why Midoriya made him feel threatened. The emotional power comes from hearing Bakugo finally admit it out loud. But because the apology focuses so heavily on his internal reasoning, the scene risks becoming more about Bakugo freeing himself from what he has been carrying than about Midoriya receiving the acknowledgement he deserves. I don't think Bakugo is intentionally making excuses. I don't think the scene wants us to interpret him that way. But the structure of the apology still places his emotional journey at the center. And a lot of viewers point to Bakugo finally calling Midoriya Izuku as one of the most powerful parts of the apology. Symbolically, I understand why. Bakugo called him Deku for years. The name began as an insult meant to tell Midoriya he was useless and incapable. Calling him Izuku represents Bakugo finally recognizing him as an equal and addressing him with basic respect. That is meaningful because of where Bakugo started, but we also need to acknowledge that calling someone by their actual name is the bare minimum. Bakugo should have respected Midoriya enough to do that years earlier. The fact that it represents massive growth says more about how badly Bakugo treated Midoriya than it does about the greatness of the gesture itself. That moment is not the completion of Bakugo making amends. It's the starting line. An apology does not erase years of bullying. Calling Midoriya by his name does not restore his self-worth. Admitting his insecurity does not repair every wound he helped create. It begins a process, and I wish the series had given that process more time after the apology. And a lot of my issue with the scene also comes from Midoriya's reaction. He essentially accepts the apology. And again, I understand why he would. Midoriya is an incredibly kind person. He knows Bakugo better than almost anyone. He understands the insecurity beneath Bakugo's aggression. He may have emotionally forgiven him long before Bakugo ever apologized. There was also years of history between them, so I'm not saying his acceptance is unrealistic. But Midoriya's low self-worth also matters. Sometimes a person's self-worth can be so damaged that they accept an apology because they do not believe they deserve anything more. They may not demand accountability because they do not believe their pain deserves to take up space. They may immediately reassure the person apologizing because they are more concerned about that person's guilt than their own hurt. And I think Midoriya does reassure him right after he apologizes, not about his behavior, but he does reassure him about the negative things he said while he was on his Vigilante Deku arc. And I'm not saying that that's the only reason Midoriya accepts the apology, but it should be part of the conversation. The apology resolves something for Bakugo. It allows him to verbalize his guilt and become the friend he should have been, but we receive far less exploration of what the apology means for Midoriya. After years of bullying, degradation, violence, fear, and emotional damage, the apology feels like the most the story is willing to give us. And for me, that is not enough. And I understand the circumstances. This is a shonen. Midoriya is exhausted, he's isolated, Class 1A is trying to bring him home. A war is happening. The story cannot simply stop for an hour-long conversation. But that's exactly why I question making that scene the primary emotional resolution of their relationship. If the circumstances do not allow the apology to receive the time and depth it deserves, then perhaps it should not be treated as the culmination. Bakugo could have apologized briefly in that moment and returned to the conversation later. He could have spoken to Midoriya privately after the immediate danger had passed. Midoriya could have had time to truly respond. He could have explained how Bakugo's behavior affected him. He could have accepted the apology while admitting that he did not know how to process it. He could have forgiven Bakugo without pretending the pain disappeared instantly. That would have made the apology feel like the beginning of reconciliation rather than the completion of it. And I'm not saying the pain disappeared instantly. I'm just saying in terms of that apology. And this is the reason I'm going to go back to a silent voice for a second when talking about bullying, forgiveness, and redemption. I have my own issues with Shoya and Shoko's relationship. I have said before that I do not necessarily think it needed to become romantic, and I have questioned whether Shoko forgives Shoya too quickly. But Shoya's attempt to make amends is not treated as one speech that resolves everything. He recognizes that Shoko did not deserve what he did to her. He does not expect one apology to repair years of pain. He spends significant time trying to reconnect with her, learning sign language, supporting her, and becoming a different person. His redemption is demonstrated over an extended period. Bakugo also demonstrates his change through actions. He protects Midoriya, he supports him, he risks his life for him. He eventually becomes a genuine friend. I'm not taking any of that away from him, but the apology itself still focuses more heavily on explaining Bakugo than acknowledging Midoriya. And because Midoriya receives so little opportunity to respond, the emotional focus remains on how difficult the confession is for Bakugo, not on what it means for Midoriya to hear it. This stands out even more when compared to how beautifully My Hero Academia handles Endeavor and the Todoroki family. To be completely clear, I'm not saying Bakugo is as bad as Endeavor. Their actions are not equivalent. Endeavor abused his wife and children for years. He treated his family like tools. He helped create the circumstances that led Toya toward becoming Dabi. The nature and scale of the harm are different, but the compassion is useful because both storylines involve someone who caused deep emotional damage attempting to become a better person. With Endeavor, the series never pretends personal growth erases the past. Shoto is allowed to hate him. Natsuo is allowed to refuse forgiveness. Fuyumi is allowed to desire reconciliation. Rei is allowed to have complicated emotions. Each family member responds differently, and the story respects those different responses. Endeavor understands he cannot demand forgiveness. He cannot become a better person and expect his family to forget what he did. All he can do is take responsibility, change his behavior, and allow them to choose whether they want him in their lives. That is emotionally mature writing. It understands that redemption belongs to the person attempting to change, but forgiveness belongs to the people who were harmed. I wish Midoriya and Bakugo's relationship received that same level of emotional care. Midoriya did not need to hate Bakugo. He didn't need to cut him off. He did not need to reject the apology, but the story could have given him more room to process what happened. It could have allowed other characters to recognize the severity of it. It could have made reconciliation feel like a conscious decision rather than the inevitable restoration of a childhood friendship. And this connects to a larger issue I sometimes have with anime. I think I mentioned this in my A Silent Voice video, but a surprising number of stories portray characters forming profound friendships or romantic bonds with people who previously bullied or abused them. Sometimes that does happen in real life. Childhood bullies can grow up. People can change. Victims sometimes forgive them. Some people even become real friends with those who hurt them. I'm not saying that outcome is impossible or inherently wrong, but when stories repeatedly present reconciliation as the natural or ideal ending, I think we should examine the message that creates. Bakugo spent years physically and emotionally abusing Midoriya. He told him to kill himself. I'm going to keep bringing that up. He used explosions against him. He contributed to Midoriya's lack of self-worth. Then he eventually becomes one of Midoriya's greatest friends. That can be a powerful story about growth and forgiveness. But without enough attention given to the damage, it can also just suggest that if someone hurts you long enough, you should remain emotionally attached to them because one day they might become better. And I do not necessarily like that implication. The Todoroki storyline presents a healthier range of possibilities. Some people forgive, some reconcile cautiously, some never do. All of those responses are treated as valid. Midoriya did not need to respond like Natsuo, but I wish the story had made it clearer that his decision to remain close to Bakugo was one possible response, not necessarily the response everyone should aspire to. And to be clear, Bakugo deserved empathy, but Midoriya deserved accountability. This is ultimately the balance I think the series was missing. Bakugo deserved empathy. He was a child shaped by an unhealthy environment. His superiority complex came from years of praise and pressure. His cruelty came from insecurity and fear. He needed adults who could understand him. He needed people who could help him separate strength from worth. He needed to be saved from the person he was becoming. But none of that should have required minimizing what he did to Midoriya. Understanding him should not mean centering him in every conversation about the relationship. Allowing Bakugo to heal should not mean treating Midoriya's forgiveness as automatic. The story could have helped Bakugo while still protecting Midoriya. It could have offered Bakugo empathy while firmly holding him responsible. It could have celebrated his eventual growth while giving Midoriya room to acknowledge his pain. It could have recognized that Bakugo was hurting without forgetting that he chose to make Midoriya hurt too. And Bakugo's redemption is good, but the foundation still matters. I can appreciate Bakugo's redemption. I can acknowledge that he becomes a great hero. I can acknowledge that he becomes a much better person. I can believe that he ultimately becomes a true friend of Midoriya. And I can still believe the foundation of their relationship was deeply unhealthy and deserved far more exploration. Those ideas do not contradict each other. In fact, I think Bakugo's redemption would have been stronger if the series had treated his earlier behavior with greater seriousness. Accountability would not have weakened his development, it would have strengthened it. Allowing Midoriya to confront his pain would not have made him cruel, it would have shown that his feelings and well-being mattered too. Having All Might Aizawa or his classmates recognize the relationship for what it was would not have prevented Bakugo from changing. It would have made that change feel even more necessary. Because becoming a better person is important, but when a character's growth is built on years of harm, the story should not only celebrate who that person eventually becomes, it should also fully acknowledge what the other person had to survive before they got there. Another really small moment that reflects my issue happens when Midoriya explains the origin of the name Deku. He tells Ida and Uraraka that Bakugo gave him that name as an insult because it sounded like a word meaning useless or incapable. Ida immediately recognizes that this is wrong, and Uraraka gives Midoriya a more positive interpretation of the name. She tells him that Deku sounds like someone who can do something, and Midoriya eventually chooses to reclaim it as his hero name. And I like that moment. I love that moment. It is sweet that Uraraka helps Midoriya take something that was used to hurt him and turn it into something empowering. But the scene also moves past what Midoriya just revealed remarkably quickly. He has essentially told his new friends that someone has spent years calling him useless. Yet there is not much concern about the person who did it. Ida says that using a name to insult someone is wrong, but neither he nor Uraraka really ask how long Bakugo had treated Midoriya this way or how deeply it affected him. Neither of them appears particularly angry on Midoriya's behalf. The emotional focus becomes Midoriya reclaiming the nickname rather than anyone confronting the fact that Bakugo used it to degrade him for years. Again, I'm not saying Uraraka did anything wrong by helping Midoriya redefine the name. That's genuinely a kind thing to do, and I love those two, honestly. But it reflects the larger pattern. Midoriya reveals something painful about how Bakugo treated him, the people around him briefly acknowledge it, and then the story moves towards something more uplifting without fully examining the original harm. And one of the clearest examples that Bakugo's behavior did not remain in middle school is the first battle trial at UA. Bakugo was placed against Midoriya, and he immediately turns the exercise into something intensely personal. This is not simply competitive frustration. Bakugo is furious that Midoriya has a quirk. He believes Midoriya has been hiding it from him, and instead of approaching the exercise like controlled hero training, he treats it as an opportunity to attack Midoriya and force answers out of him. At one point, Bakugo uses an attack powerful enough that All Might has to warn him about the potential consequences. Bakugo responds by saying Midoriya will be fine as long as he dodges. Really think about that response. He is being told that his attack could cause serious harm or even kill Midoriya, and his answer is essentially that Midoriya should avoid being hit. That is not responsible behavior from someone training to become a hero. It shows that Bakugo is so consumed by his own anger that he is willing to place Midoriya in genuine danger during a supervised school exercise. And this is happening after he has entered UA. This is not merely something Bakugo did as a much younger child before the story began. His aggression follows Midoriya directly into high school. That should have resulted in more than a warning during the exercise. It should have prompted a serious conversation about why Bakugo becomes this violent around Midoriya and whether Midoriya feels safe even training beside him. Instead, the exercise ends, Bakugo loses, and the story focuses mainly on how emotionally shaken he is by discovering that Midoriya has power. Once again, Bakugo's pain becomes a central emotional concern, while the danger he placed Midoriya in receives much less attention. And even before the battle trial, Aizawa has to physically restrain Bakugo from attacking Midoriya. When Bakugo realizes that Midoriya has a quirk, his immediate reaction is to rush toward him aggressively. Aizawa stops him using his capture weapon. That moment is played quickly, but it reveals something serious. A teacher witnesses one student attempting to attack another student simply because he's angry and confused. And this is not a random disagreement between two classmates who have just met. Bakugo's reaction is connected to years of hostility toward Midoriya. Aizawa may not know the full history at that moment, but seeing that level of aggression should have raised questions. Why is Bakugo reacting this intensely? Why does Midoriya seem familiar with and afraid of that behavior? Has this happened before? Instead, Aizawa stops the immediate attack and continues with the class. There is no investigation. There is no private conversation with Midoriya. There is no attempt to understand whether this is part of an established pattern. The scene becomes another example of an adult managing Bakugo's behavior in the moment without addressing its underlying cause. Bakugo is restrained, but he is not meaningfully confronted. And Midoriya is protected from that one attack, but no one appears interested in determining how many times he has already been attacked before that. And another thing I find strange is how little anger Midoriya's friends display toward Bakugo after learning how he's treated him. I'm not saying Class 1A should have permanently hated Bakugo. I'm not saying Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, or anyone else needed to reject him forever. But Midoriya is one of the kindest people in their class. He repeatedly risks himself to save others. He supports his classmates, he encourages them, he goes out of his way to understand everyone around him. So it feels strange that after learning someone spent years degrading and frightening him, very few people appear genuinely angry on his behalf. Most teenagers will probably have some reaction. They might ask Midoriya why he still spends time around Bakugo. They might become more protective of him. They might confront Bakugo. They might at least privately recognize that what happened was much more serious than a childhood disagreement. Instead, Bakugo's history with Midoriya is mostly absorbed into the class's general understanding that Bakugo is difficult. He's loud, he's rude, he yells at everyone. That's simply how he is. But his treatment of Midoriya was not the same as the way he casually insults everyone else. There was history behind it. There was a power imbalance behind it. There was targeted cruelty behind it. The lack of anger from Midoriya's friends contributes to the feeling that the narrative does not fully recognize the severity of what happened. Midoriya never has to ask them to not hate Bakugo because they rarely become angry enough for that conversation to be necessary. And even after Midoriya and Bakugo are described as becoming proper rivals, Bakugo doesn't suddenly begin treating Midoriya with consistent respect. The relationship improves. I want to acknowledge that. Bakugo's later behavior is not identical to the abuse from their childhood. He begins recognizing Midoriya's strength, he cooperates with him more often, he gradually becomes more protective of him. There is real development, but he is still regularly rude to Midoriya. He still insults him, he still communicates through aggression, he still struggles to treat him with basic warmth or respect. Some of that is simply Bakugo's personality. He is abrasive toward nearly everyone, but calling them proper rivals can make the relationship sound healthier than it actually is at that point. They have begun moving towards something healthier. They have not fully arrived there. There's a difference between the active abuse of their childhood and Bakugo's later rudeness, but there's also continuity between them. The story sometimes treats the rivalry label as though it clearly replaces what came before, but the emotional history does not disappear simply because Bakugo begins acknowledging Midoriya as a legitimate competitor. Respecting Midoriya's strength is not the same as fully respecting Midoriya as a person. Oh, I'm trying not to let the video get too long, but it's already at 50 minutes, so I'm going to try and speed it up a little bit. But another factor that affects how audiences and characters respond to Bakugo is that he's portrayed as exceptionally capable in almost every area. He's one of the strongest students, he's academically intelligent, he has excellent combat instincts, he understands his quirk deeply, he adapts quickly, he is talented at cooking, he can play music, he's observant, he's disciplined, he works extremely hard. In many situations, Bakugo has the ability to support the confidence he projects, and none of that is inherently bad writing. Bakugo is supposed to be gifted. His talent is part of what created his superiority complex in the first place. But because he is so competent, his behavior is frequently validated even when his attitude is terrible. He insults everyone, but he wins. He refuses to cooperate, but his instincts are often correct. He acts arrogantly, but he frequently has the talent to justify his confidence. He treats people poorly, but he still earns admiration from teachers and classmates. As a result, his flaws do not always cost him enough to balance how often the story rewards his abilities. The audience has repeatedly shown that Bakugo is rude, but also brilliant, aggressive, but effective, difficult, but usually right. That makes it easier for his cruelty to be reframed as part of the personality of an exceptional person. It becomes, yes, he is a jerk, but look at how talented he is. And that is almost the exact mentality that created the problem during his childhood. People were so impressed by what Bakugo could do that they failed to correct who he was becoming. And Best Genius is one of the few adults who directly recognizes that Bakugo's attitude is a problem. He attempts to improve Bakugo's appearance, speech, and public presentation. He wants Bakugo to understand that being a hero involves more than power. A hero must also reassure people, carry themselves properly, and represent something others can trust. That is a valuable lesson, but even this intervention focuses largely on the surface. Best Genius wants to refine Bakugo. He wants to turn his aggression into a more acceptable public image. He changes his hair, he corrects his mannerisms, he attempts to teach him dignity. But the deeper issue is not simply that Bakugo looks or sounds unprofessional. The deeper issue is that he has spent years directing his insecurity towards someone else. His behavior toward Midoriya is not merely a branding problem. It is not something that can be corrected by improving his posture, language, or hairstyle. Best Genius efforts are useful, but the storyline is played somewhat comedically and endearingly. It becomes another example of an adult recognizing that Bakugo needs adjustment without fully confronting the most serious reason he needs it. He's taught how a hero should appear before being thoroughly challenged on how a hero should treat a vulnerable person. And at the end of the day, I also want to acknowledge something important. My Hero Academia is a shonen. Because of that, there are naturally going to be moments where character interactions are exaggerated for comedy, personalities are larger than life, and emotional realism occasionally takes a backseat to entertainment. That is a part of the genre. And honestly, for a shonen, I think My Hero Academia handles emotions exceptionally well. This is a series that gave us some incredible emotional storylines. The Todoroki family is, in my opinion, one of the best depictions of abuse, accountability, and redemption in modern shonen. All Might's relationship with Midoriya is beautiful. Gentle Criminal and La Brava are fantastic. Twice is heartbreaking. Endeavor's redemption is incredibly nuanced. Even Bakugo himself becomes a genuinely wonderful character. I want to stress that because I think some people hear criticisms like mine and assume I dislike Bakugo or think his redemption failed. I don't. I think Bakugo's development is beautiful. Watching him slowly learn humility, acknowledge Midoriya, risk his own life for him, apologize, and eventually become someone worthy of standing beside him is one of the strongest character arcs in the series. He absolutely becomes a much better person. That isn't what I've been arguing. My argument has always been that the story doesn't always treat the beginning of that journey with the same emotional weight that it deserves. And even after Bakugo matures, I think you can still see traces of that. The series continues to play a lot of his bad behavior for comedy. Now, to be fair, some of that is simply Bakugo. He's loud, he's abrasive, he's intense. That is part of who he is, and I don't think he should suddenly become this quiet, polite, completely different person by the end of the story. That wouldn't feel like Bakugo. But there are still some moments where his behavior that would realistically be a serious problem is framed as a joke. One example is when it's revealed that Bakugo has struggled to gain sidekicks. Initially, the obvious conclusion, and the one the audience is encouraged to make, is that people simply couldn't stand working with him because of how he treated them. Given everything we've seen from Bakugo throughout the series, that's a completely reasonable assumption. But then the story reveals that Bakugo actually wanted sidekicks who would tell him they intended to surpass him. In other words, there were noble intentions underneath his behavior all along. Again, it's another instance where someone looks at Bakugo's actions, judges them based on how he presents himself, and the story eventually says, well, actually, he had a good reason. He meant something else. He wasn't really what he appeared to be. And while I appreciate the additional depth that gives Bakugo, I also think it's representative of a broader pattern. His intentions frequently soften our perception of his behavior. Sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it isn't. Another example is his hero rankings as an adult. Even after all of his growth, Bakugo's rank drops because of his attitude and the way he interacts with people. That makes perfect sense. Public perception matters. Being a hero isn't just about defeating villains, it's about inspiring confidence, reassuring civilians, and representing the profession well. Bakugo still struggles with that, but even this is largely played for laughs. It's another comedic beat, another joke about Bakugo being Bakugo. And while I laugh too, it also reinforces something I've been saying throughout the video. Even after all of his growth, there are still aspects of Bakugo's behavior that are unbecoming of what we expect from a professional hero. The story recognizes that. It even gives him consequences for it. But those consequences are still frequently framed comedically rather than seriously. Now, none of that ruins the series for me, not even close. In fact, despite every criticism I've made throughout this video, I still consider My Hero Academia one of the greatest anime I've ever watched. It was a huge part of my middle school years. I grew up with these characters. I watched Midoriya inherit One for All. I watched Class 1A slowly become heroes. I watched All Might's final fight. I watched Endeavor struggle to become someone worthy of redemption. I watched Bakugo grow from an insecure kid who believed strength was everything into someone willing to lay down his life for another person. Those moments are unforgettable. That's why I've spent so much time talking about this relationship. Not because I hate it, but because I think it had the potential to be even stronger. Bakugo's redemption is genuinely one of the highlights of the series. I just wish the story had given the beginning of his relationship with Midoriya the same level of emotional nuance that it gave so many of its other incredible character arcs. Because if it had, I honestly think it would have been one of the greatest redemption stories in anime. And despite my criticisms, My Hero Academia remains one of my favorite anime of all time. It's a series I'll always recommend, a story I'll always look back on fondly, and one that will always be a staple of my childhood. Sometimes our favorite stories are the ones we have the most to say about, and for me, My Hero Academia will always be one of those stories. Now, I know this has been a long video. I think we're right at the hour mark, so if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I genuinely love to hear what you think. Do you agree with my perspective, or do you think I'm being too harsh on the way My Hero Academia handled Bakugo and Midoriya's relationship? Let me know down in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and I'd love to have a respectful discussion. And if there are moments from the series that you think either strengthen or weaken my argument, I'd love to hear about those too. Maybe there's a scene I overlooked, or maybe there's another perspective I haven't considered. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. It really helps the channel. And if you enjoy long-form anime analysis like this, consider subscribing. I have plenty more videos planned covering My Hero Academia, Naruto, Hunter x Hunter, I've already done Silent Voice, and Scott Pilgrim, and a lot of other series I love. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.